Historicism, and Worldview philosophy. Historicism takes its position in the factual sphere of the empirical life of spirit, and by positing it absolutely, without exactly naturalizing it, especially as the specific sense of nature is far removed from historical thought, and at any rate does not influence the latter in a generally determinative way, a relativism arises that has a close kinship with naturalistic psychologism, and that entangles us in analogous skeptical difficulties. Of interest to us here is only what is peculiar to historicistic skepticism, with which we want to become more thoroughly familiar. All spiritual formation, the phrase thought in as wide a sense as possible, which may include every kind of social unity, at the lowermost level that of the individual himself, but also of every cultural formation, has its inner structure, its typology, and its wondrous wealth of outer and inner forms, which arise in the stream of spiritual life itself, are in turn transformed, and in the transformation themselves cause other structural and typical distinctions to emerge. In the perceptible outer world, the structure and typology of organic becoming offer us precise analogues. Therein there are no fixed species, and there is no construction of the same, made of fixed organic elements. Everything, seemingly fixed, is a stream of development. If, through inner intuition, we immerse ourselves in the unity of the life of spirit, we can feel our way into the motivations prevailing therein, and also understand the essence and development of the respective form of spirit in its dependence on the spiritual motives of unity and development. In this way, everything historical becomes understandable, explicable for us in its peculiarity of being, which is precisely the being of spirit, unity of internally mutually conditioning moments of a sense, and therefore unity of taking shape and developing in accordance with inner motivations and that sense. Also in this way, then, art, religion, morals, and the like can be intuitively inquired into. Likewise the worldview, which is closely related to them and at the same time comes to expression in them, and which, if it assumes the forms of science and lays claim to objective validity after the manner of science, used to be called metaphysics or even philosophy. Hence, with regard to such philosophies, the great task arises of exploring their morphological structure and typology, as well as their developmental connections, and of bringing to historical understanding the motivations of spirit that determine their essence by living in the most inward accord with those philosophies. How much that is of significance, and indeed admirable, is to be achieved in this regard is shown by Wilhelm Dilthey's writings, particularly the recently published treatise on the types of worldview. Thus far the talk was, of course, of historical science, but not of historicism. We seize most easily upon the motives that impel one towards the latter when we follow a few sentences from Dilthey's presentation. We read, of the reasons that give skepticism nourishment ever anew, one of the most effective is the anarchy of philosophical systems. However, the doubts that have arisen out of the progressive development of historical consciousness reach far more deeply than the skeptical inferences from the opposition of human opinions. The doctrine of development, as a natural scientific doctrine of evolution, interwoven with the knowledge of the history of the development of cultural formations, is necessarily bound up with the knowledge of the relativity of the historical form of life. In the gaze that encompasses the earth and all pasts disappears, the absolute validity of any one individual form of life constitution, religion, and philosophy. Thus the formation of historical consciousness destroys even more fundamentally than the overview of the conflict of the systems, the belief in the universal validity of any one of the philosophies that have undertaken to express the world nexus in a compelling way through a nexus of concepts. There is obviously no doubt about the factual truth of what was just said. The question, however, is whether, taken in principial universality, it can be legitimate. Certainly, a worldview and a worldview philosophy are cultural formations that come into being and disappear in the stream of the development of mankind, whereby their spiritual content is determinately motivated under the given historical circumstances. Yet the same holds also of the rigorous sciences. Do they, for that reason, lack objective validity? A very extreme historicist might well affirm this, pointing here to the change in scientific views, how what is regarded today as proven theory will tomorrow be seen to be void, how some speak of certain laws, whereas others call them mere hypotheses, and still others call them vague notions, etc. In view of this continual change of scientific views, would we really have no right, then, to speak of sciences not only as cultural formations, but also as objective unities of validity? One easily sees that, when historicism is constantly carried through to its conclusion, one ends up with extreme skeptical subjectivism. The ideas truth, theory, science would then, like all ideas, lose their absolute validity. For an idea to have validity would therefore mean that it is a factual construct of spirit that is held to be valid and, in this facticity of being valid, determines thought. Validity that is unqualified, or in itself, that is what it is even if no one happens to affect it, and no historical mankind would ever affect it. There is no such thing. Nor is there any such validity in the case of the principle of non-contradiction and all logic, which nowadays is in complete flux anyway. Perhaps the end result is that the logical principles of non-contradictoriness turn into their opposite, and furthermore all the sentences that we just expressed, and even the possibilities that we considered, and claimed as validly existing, would have no validity in themselves, etc. It is not necessary to continue along these lines and repeat discussions that have been presented elsewhere. The foregoing should suffice to gain the concession that, however great are the difficulties that the relationship between what obtains in the flux and objective validity, between science as cultural appearance and science as the system of valid theory, may pose to the clarifying understanding, the distinction and opposition must be acknowledged. Yet, if we have conceded that science is a valid idea, what reason would we still have not to regard similar distinctions between what obtains historically and what is valid as at least open, whether or not we may be able to understand them by way of a critique of reason? The science of history, empirical human science in general, cannot determine at all, neither in the positive nor in the negative sense, whether a distinction is to be made between religion as cultural formation and religion as idea, that is, as valid religion, between art as cultural formation and valid art, between historical and valid law, and finally, also, between historical and valid philosophy. Whether or not between the one and the other, put platonically, there exists a relationship between the idea and its murky manifestations. And if spiritual formations can in truth be considered and judged with respect to such oppositions of validity, then the scientific decision about validity itself and its ideal normative principles is by no means a matter for empirical science. The mathematicians will not turn to historical science to be instructed about the truth of mathematical theories. It will not occur to him to link the historical development of mathematical presentations and judgments to the question of truth. So how is the historian at all supposed to decide about the truth of the given philosophical systems and, what is more, about the possibility of a science that is valid in itself? And what could he ever adduce that could cause the philosopher to waver in the belief in his idea, that of a true philosophy? Whoever denies a particular system, no less whoever denies the ideal possibility of a philosophical system in general, must adduce reasons. Historical facts about development, even the most general facts about the kind of development of systems in general, may be reasons, even good reasons. But historical reasons can yield only historical consequences. To want either to justify or to refute ideas from facts is countersense. To get water from a pumice stone, to use Kant's quotation. Thus, just as the science of history cannot say anything relevant against the possibility of absolute validities in general, likewise it cannot say anything in particular against the possibility of an absolute, that is, scientific metaphysics or any other philosophy. As historical science, it can never justify even the assertion that thus far there has been no scientific philosophy. It can only justify it based on the other sources of knowledge, and those are obviously already philosophical. For it is clear that philosophical critique, too, insofar as it is actually to lay claim to validity, is philosophy, and that its sense implies the ideal possibility of a systematic philosophy as rigorous science. The unconditional assertion that every scientific philosophy is a chimera, with the justification that the alleged attempts over the millennia make probable the intrinsic impossibility of such philosophy, is absurd, not only because an inference from a few millennia of higher culture to a boundless future would not be a good induction, but is absurd in an absolute countersense, like 2 times 2 equals 5. And this is for the reason indicated. If philosophical critique finds something it can refute with objective validity, then there is also a field in which something can be justified with objective validity. If the problems have been proved to have been framed obliquely, then it is possible to set them right and pose straight problems. If critique proves that philosophy as it has developed historically operates with muddled concepts, that it has mixed concepts and has drawn false inferences, then therein lies undeniably, if one does not want to get mired in senselessness, that, put ideally, the concepts can be elucidated, clarified, and kept distinct, that in the given field correct inferences can be drawn, etc. Every legitimate, deeply penetrating critique itself provides means of progress, points to ideally legitimate goals and paths, and thus to an objectively valid science. One would also have to say, of course, that the historical untenability of a spiritual formation as a fact has nothing whatsoever to do with untenability in the sense of validity, which, like everything said thus far, is applicable to every sphere in which validity is claimed. What may still mislead the historicist is the fact that by immersing ourselves in a historically reconstructed spiritual formation, in the intending or signifying prevailing in it, as well as in the connections of the motivations belonging to it, we not only can understand their sense, but also can judge their relative value. If we think our way, say, assumptively, into the premises that a historical philosopher had at his disposal, we may perhaps be able to acknowledge, even admire, the relative consistency of his philosophy. In another respect, excuse any inconsistencies due to shifts and confoundings of the problems, which are held to have been unavoidable given the level of the problematic and analysis of signification at the time. We may consider as a great achievement the successful solution of a scientific philosophy that, today, belongs to a class of problems that a high school student could easily master, and there are analogues in every region. By contrast, we obviously continue to maintain that the principles even of such relative evaluations lie in ideal spheres that the valuing historian, who does not want to understand mere developments, can only presuppose, but not, as historian, justify. The norm of the mathematical lies in mathematics, that of the logical in logic, that of the ethical in ethics, etc. He would have to seek reasons and methods of justification in these disciplines if he wanted to proceed scientifically also in the valuation. If in this respect there are no rigorously developed sciences, well then he values on his own responsibility, say, as an ethical man or one who believes in a particular religion, but at any rate not as a scientific historian. If I therefore regard historicism as an epistemological aberration that, owing to its countersensical consequences, must be just as brusquely rejected as naturalism, then I would nevertheless like to emphasize expressly that I fully acknowledge the tremendous value of history in the broadest sense for the philosopher. For him, the discovery of the common spirit is just as significant as the discovery of nature. Indeed, the immersion in the general life of spirit provides the philosopher with more original, and therefore more fundamental, material for inquiry than does the immersion in nature. For the realm of phenomenology, as a doctrine of essence, stretches from the individual spirit soon over the whole field of universal spirit. And although Dilthey shows in such an impressive way that psychophysical psychology is not the one that can serve as the foundation of the human sciences, I would say that it is solely the phenomenological doctrine of essence that is capable of justifying a philosophy of spirit. We now move to a consideration of the sense and legitimacy of worldview philosophy, in order to compare it later with philosophy as a rigorous science. The worldview philosophy of modernity is, as was already indicated above, a child of historicistic skepticism. Normally, the latter spares the positive sciences, to which it, as inconsistent as it is, like every skepticism, ascribes the value of actual validity. Worldview philosophy accordingly presupposes all the individual sciences as treasure troves of objective truth, and to the extent that it finds its goal in satisfying as far as possible our need for definitive and unifying, all-comprehending, and all-understanding knowledge, it regards all individual sciences as its foundations. As a consequence, it occasionally calls itself scientific philosophy, since it is built on firm sciences. However, since, properly understood, not only the scientific character of the foundations belongs to the scientific character of a discipline, but also the scientific character of the goal-setting problems, the scientific character of the methods, and especially also a certain logical harmony between the guiding problems on the one hand, and such foundations and methods on the other, the expression scientific philosophy does not mean much. And indeed, the expression is generally not understood in all its seriousness. Most worldview philosophers certainly feel that the claim they lay to the scientific rigor of their philosophy does not fare very well, and many of them admit quite openly, and honestly at least, to the low scientific quality of their results. Nevertheless, they set the value of that kind of philosophy, which precisely wants to be more worldview than world science, very high, and all the higher the more skeptical its stance, precisely under the influence of historicism, towards the aim of rigorous philosophical world science. Their motives, which at the same time determine more precisely the sense of worldview philosophy, are roughly as follows. Every great philosophy is not only a historical fact, but in the development of the spiritual life of mankind, it also has a great, indeed unique, teleological function, namely as the highest intensification of the life experience, culture, and wisdom of its age. Let us dwell for a moment on the clarification of these concepts. Experience, as personal habitus, is the precipitation of acts of natural, experiential position-taking that have occurred in the course of life. This habitus is essentially conditioned by the way in which the personality, as this particular individuality, is motivated by acts of its own experience, and no less by the way in which it takes in foreign and transmitted experiences by approving of or rejecting them. As for the cognitive acts bearing the title experience, there can be cognitions of natural existence of every kind, either simple perceptions, and other acts of immediately intuitable cognition, or the acts of thought grounded on them at different levels of logical treatment and legitimation. But that is not enough. We also have experiences of works of art, and other values of beauty, no less of ethical values, whether on the basis of our own ethical conduct or of perceiving that of others, likewise of goods, things of practical utility, and things of technical serviceability. In short, we not only have theoretical but also axiological and practical experiences. Analysis shows that the latter point back to valuing and willing lived experiences as bases of intuition. On such experiences are also based experiential cognitions of a higher logical dignity. Thus, one who is experienced all around, or as we also say, who is cultivated, has not only experience of the world, but also religious, aesthetic, ethical, political, practical, technical, etc. experience, or culture. However, we use this admittedly well-worn word, culture, inasmuch as we, of course, have its opposite, lack of culture, only for forms of habitus described that are of relatively higher value. The old-fashioned word wisdom, worldly wisdom, world and life wisdom, and most of all the now popular expression world and life view, or simply worldview, refer to particularly high levels of value. We will have to regard wisdom, or worldview in this sense, as an essential component of that still more valuable human habitus, that we have in mind in the idea of perfect virtue, and that characterizes habitual excellence in relation to all possible directions of human position-taking, to cognitional, valuational, and volitional position-takings. For with this excellence goes hand in hand the well-formed ability to judge rationally about the objectualities of such position-takings, about the environing world, values, goods, deeds, etc., or to be able to legitimate expressly the position-takings of that habitus, yet that presupposes wisdom and belongs among its higher forms. Wisdom or worldview in this determinate sense, the one that includes a variety of types and valuational gradations, is, and this need not be further elaborated, no mere achievement of an isolated personality, which would be an abstraction anyway. The personality belongs to a cultural community and an age, and it makes good sense in relation to its most pronounced forms to speak of the culture and worldview not only of a particular individual, but also of the age. That holds especially of the forms now to be dealt with. By grasping in thought the wisdom alive in a great philosophical personality, the wisdom that is inwardly richest, but still obscure to itself, still uncomprehended, one opens up possibilities of logical treatment and, on a higher level of culture, the application of the logical methodology elaborated in the rigorous sciences. That the entire content of these sciences, which, after all, confront the individual as valid demands of the common spirit, belongs at this level to the substructure of a valuable culture or worldview, is obvious. Now, insofar as the vital and therefore most persuasive cultural motives of the age are not only grasped conceptually, but also are unfolded logically and are otherwise treated in thought, and the results gained thereby are brought to scientific unification and consistent completion in interplay with newly accruing intuitions and insights, an extraordinary expansion and intensification of the originally uncomprehended wisdom arises. There arises a worldview philosophy that gives in the great systems the relatively most perfect answer to the riddles of life and the world, namely that achieves in the best way possible the solution and satisfactory clarification of the theoretical, axiological, practical inconsistencies of life, that experience, wisdom, and mere world and life view are able to overcome only incompletely. The spiritual life of mankind marches on, however, with its abundance of ever newer formations, spiritual battles, experiences, and valuations and specifications of goals, with the expanded horizon of life into which all the new spiritual formations enter. Culture, wisdom, and worldview change. Philosophy changes, climbing to higher and higher peaks. Insofar as the value of worldview philosophy, and thus also of the striving for such philosophy, is initially conditioned by the value of wisdom and of the striving for wisdom, a special consideration of the goal it sets for itself is hardly necessary. If one takes the concept of wisdom as broadly as we did, then it certainly expresses an essential component of the ideal of the perfect excellence, achievable according to the standard of the respective phase of the life of mankind. In other words, of a relatively complete, concrete adumberation of the idea of humanity. It is thus clear how everyone is to strive to be as all-around excellent a personality as possible, excellent in accordance with all the basic orientations of life, which for their part correspond to the basic kinds of possible position-takings. Thus also to strive in each of these orientations to be as experienced as possible, as wise as possible, and therefore also to love wisdom as much as possible. According to the idea, every striving man is necessarily a philosopher in the most original sense of the word. According to the idea, every striving person is necessarily a philosopher in the most original sense of the word, as is well known out of the natural reflections on the best paths by which to achieve the high goal of humanity. And thus at the same time of perfect wisdom, a technique has arisen, that of the virtuous or excellent man. If, as is the rule, it is defined as a technique of correct action, then this obviously amounts to the same thing. For consistently excellent action, which is, after all, what is meant here, leads back to the excellent practical character, and this presupposes habitual perfection in an axiological and intellectual respect. Conscious striving for perfection presupposes in turn striving for all-around wisdom. In a material respect, this discipline directs the one striving to the different groups of values, those in the sciences, the arts, religion, etc., that every acting individual has to acknowledge as transsubjective and binding validity. And one of the highest of these values is the very idea of this wisdom and perfect excellence. Of course, this ethical technique, whether kept more popular or scientific, also enters into the framework of a worldview philosophy, which for its part, with all its provinces, as soon as it has arisen in the communal consciousness of its age, and faces the individual persuasively as an objective validity, must become a highly significant cultural force, a point from which the most valuable cultural energies radiate for the most valuable personalities of the age. After having done full justice to the high value of worldview philosophy, it may well seem that nothing could prevent us from unconditionally recommending that one strive for such philosophy. Yet, perhaps it can be shown that with regard to the idea of philosophy, there are still other and, from certain points of view, higher values to be satisfied, namely those of a philosophical science. The following should be borne in mind. Our consideration is carried out at the level of the scientific culture of our age, which is an age of immense powers of objectified rigorous science. For modern consciousness, the ideas culture or worldview and science, understood as a practical idea, were sharply distinguished, and they remain distinguished from now on for all eternity. We may regret it, but we must accept it as a fact that continues to have an effect, a fact that has to determine our practical position takings in a corresponding way. The historical philosophies were certainly worldview philosophies, insofar as the drive for wisdom dominated their creators. But they were just as much scientific philosophies, insofar as the goal of rigorous science also was alive in them. Both goals were either not yet at all, or not sharply distinguished. In practical striving they flowed together. They also lay at finite distances, however high above the one striving for them may have felt them to be. That has changed completely since the constitution of a supratemporal universitas of rigorous sciences. Generations upon generations work enthusiastically on the immense edifice of science and add their modest objects of inquiry to it, ever conscious of the fact that the edifice is infinite and will never ever be completed. Worldview is also an idea, of course, but that of a goal lying in the finite, to be actualized principially in an individual lifetime after the manner of steady approach, just like morality, which would certainly lose its sense if it were the idea of a principially transfinite infinite. The idea of worldview is accordingly for each age a different one, as should be quite clear from the foregoing analysis of its concept. By contrast, the idea of science is a supratemporal one, and here that means that it is not limited by any relation to the spirit of an age. Now connected with these distinctions are essential distinctions in the directions of practical goals. After all, our life goals are generally of a double nature. Some are for time, others for eternity. The former serve our own perfection and that of our contemporaries. The latter also serve the perfection of posterity, down to the most distant generations. Science is a title for absolute, timeless values. Every such value, once discovered, belongs henceforth to the value treasures of all subsequent mankind, and obviously determines forthwith the material content of the ideas of culture, wisdom, worldview, as well as that of worldview philosophy. Thus, there is a sharp distinction between worldview philosophy and scientific philosophy, as two ideas that are related to one another in a certain way, but are not to be confounded with one another. Here it should be noted that the former is by no means the imperfect realization of the latter in time, for if our interpretation is correct, then thus far there has yet to be any realization of that idea whatsoever. That is to say, in our age, there is no philosophy that is currently under way as rigorous science. There is no doctrinal system, not even an incomplete one that has been objectively set forth in the unified spirit of a community of investigators. On the other hand, there were worldview philosophies already millennia ago. Nevertheless, one can say that the realizations of these ideas, if such is presupposed by both, would asymptotically approach and coincide with one another in the infinite, were we to imagine the infinite of science, fictively as a point infinitely far away. The concept of philosophy would thereby have to be grasped in a correspondingly broad way, and in fact so broadly that it would encompass, in addition to the specifically philosophical sciences, all individual sciences, after they have been transformed into philosophies, through the clarification and evaluation proper to the critique of reason. If we take the two distinct ideas as contents of life goals, then it follows that in contrast to striving proper to a worldview, a completely different inquiring striving is possible, one that, while fully conscious that science can never again be the complete creation of an individual, nevertheless devotes the greatest energies in cooperation with others, imbued with the same ethos, to helping a scientific philosophy make its breakthrough and develop further step by step. The great question of the present is, aside from their clear separation, the relative valuation of these goals, and thereby also of their practical compatibility. From the outset, we concede that from the standpoint of philosophizing individuals, a universally valid decision for one or the other kind of philosophizing cannot be given. The one group consists of predominantly theoretical men, by nature inclined to seek their vocation in rigorously scientific inquiry, if only the province of such inquiry that attracts them holds promise. Thereby it may well be that the interest, even the passionate interest, in this province derives from emotional needs, say, needs stirred by a worldview. By contrast, for aesthetic and practical natures, for artists, theologians, jurists, etc., the situation is different. They see their vocation in the realization of aesthetic or practical ideals, thus ideals of an extra-theoretical sphere. Among them we also count theological, legal, and in the broadest sense, technical investigators and writers, insofar as through their writings they do not want to promote pure theory, but primarily to influence practice. Admittedly, in the actuality of life itself, the distinction is not exactly sharp, and precisely in an age in which practical motives rise up overpoweringly, even a theoretical nature would be able to give in more intensely to the force of such motives than his theoretical vocation would permit. But this poses a great danger, particularly for the philosophy of our age. The question must be raised, however, not only from the standpoint of the individual, but also from that of mankind and of history, namely, insofar as we consider what it means for the development of culture, for the possibility of a steadily progressing realization of the idea of the eternity of mankind, not of man in individuo, whether the question will be decided predominantly in one or the other sense. In other words, whether the tendency towards the one kind of philosophy completely dominates the age and causes the tendency towards the other, let us say, scientific philosophy, to die out. That, too, is a practical question. For our historical influences, and thus also our ethical responsibilities, extend to the farthest reaches of the ethical ideal, to those that mark the idea of the development of mankind. It is clear how the decision at issue would arise for a theoretical nature if indubitable beginnings of philosophical doctrine were available. Let us look at other sciences. All primeval mathematical or natural scientific wisdom and wisdom teaching has forfeited its rights to the extent that the corresponding theoretical doctrine is justified in an objectively valid way. Science has spoken. Wisdom must learn from now on. Natural scientific striving for wisdom prior to the existence of rigorous science was by no means illegitimate. It is not discredited after the fact for its age. Faced with the exigencies of life, with the practical necessity of taking a position, man could not wait until, perhaps millennia later, science had arrived, even assuming that he was at all already familiar with the idea of rigorous science. On the other hand, every science, no matter how exact, provides a doctrinal system that is developed only to a limited degree and is surrounded by an infinite horizon of science that has yet to become actual. Now, what is to be regarded as the right goal for this horizon? the further development of rigorous doctrine or of view, wisdom. The theoretical man, the investigator of nature by vocation, will not hesitate in answering. Wherever science can speak, and if only centuries from now, he will contemptuously reject vague views. He would consider it a sin against science to recommend that one devise nature views. In doing so, he surely defends a right of future mankind. The rigorous sciences owe their greatness, and the continuity and abundant strength of their progressive development, not least precisely to the radicalism of such an ethos. Certainly every exact investigator forms his own views. In seeing, having premonitions, suspecting, he gazes beyond what has been definitively justified. But it is only with the methodical intention that he devises new pieces of rigorous doctrine. As the investigator of nature well knows, this position-taking does not preclude that experience in the pre-scientific sense, although bound up with insights of science, plays a significant role within natural scientific technique. The technical tasks have to be dealt with. The house, the machine must be built. There can be no waiting until natural science can give exact information about everything of concern. As a practical man, the technician therefore decides differently than the natural scientific theoretician. From the latter he takes doctrine, from life he takes experience. The situation is not quite the same regarding scientific philosophy, precisely because not even a beginning of scientifically rigorous doctrine has ever been elaborated, and because the philosophy, both as historically transmitted and as that which is in the process of being vigorously developed, that intercedes for that doctrine, is at most a scientific semi-finished product, or an unsorted jumble of worldview and theoretical knowledge. On the other hand, we unfortunately cannot wait here either. The philosophical distress, as worldview distress, compels us. It becomes even greater for us the farther the sphere of the positive sciences expands. The vast abundance of scientifically explained facts with which they present us cannot help us, since they, like all the sciences, principially harbor a dimension of riddles whose solution becomes a vital question for us. The natural sciences have not deciphered for us in any respect the current actuality, the actuality in which we live, produce, and exist. The general belief that to achieve this is their function, and that they are simply not yet far enough along. The opinion that they, principially, can achieve this has revealed itself to the more perceptive to be a superstition. The necessary distinction between natural science and philosophy, as a science with a principially different tendency, though it is essentially related to natural science in several ways, is on its way to gaining recognition and being clarified. To speak with Lotz, to calculate the course of the world does not mean to understand it, yet we are no better off with the human sciences. To understand the spiritual life of mankind is certainly a great and fine thing, but unfortunately this understanding also cannot help us, and should not be confounded with the philosophical understanding that is to disclose the riddles of the world and of life for us. The spiritual distress of our age has indeed become unbearable. Would that it were only the lack of theoretical clarity about the sense of the actualities inquired into in the natural and human sciences that disturb our peace, namely, about the way in which being in the ultimate sense is known, what is to be regarded as absolute being, and whether something of that kind is at all knowable. It is indeed the most radical, vital distress from which we suffer, a distress that leaves no part of our lives untouched. All life is position-taking, and all position-taking is subject to an ought, to a verdict concerning validity or invalidity according to claimed norms that have absolute validity. As long as these norms were not disputed, were not threatened and ridiculed by any skepticism, there was only one vital question: how best to satisfy the norms in practice. What are we to do now, however, when any and every norm is contested or empirically falsified and robbed of its ideal validity? Naturalists and historicists fight for a worldview, and yet both work from different sides to reinterpret ideas as facts, and to transform all actuality, all life, into an incomprehensible idealist jumble of facts. The superstitious belief in the fact is common to them all. It is certain that we cannot wait. We must take a position. We must endeavor to resolve the disharmonies in the position we have taken on the actuality of life, which has significance for us, and in which we are to have significance, into a rational, albeit unscientific, world and life view. And if the worldview philosopher is helpful to us in this regard, should we not be thankful to him? However much truth lies in what was just asserted, however little we would like to do without the elation and invigoration that old and new philosophies offer us, it is nevertheless necessary to insist, on the other hand, that we also remain mindful of the responsibility we have to mankind. For the sake of time, we must not sacrifice eternity. In order to alleviate our distress, we must not bequeath to posterity distress upon distress as an ultimately ineradicable evil. The distress here stems from science, but only science can definitively overcome the distress that stems from science. If the skeptical critique brought by the naturalists and the historicists dissolve the genuine objective validity in all deontical regions into countersense, if the skeptical critique brought by the naturalists and the historicists dissolves the genuine objective validity in all deontical regions into countersense, if unclear, disharmonious, though naturally developed, concepts of reflection inhibit, if as a consequence ambiguous or absurd problems inhibit a proper understanding of actuality and the possibility of taking a rational position on it, if a special, but for a large class of sciences, necessary methodical attitude that is practiced habitually renders one unable to move into other attitudes, and if troubling countersenses in the interpretation of the world are connected with such prejudices, then against these and all similar ills there is only one remedy: scientific critique, and in addition a radical science, rising up from below, grounded on sure foundations, and progressing in accordance with the most rigorous method. The philosophical science we are advocating here. Worldviews can quarrel, only science can decide, and its decision bears the stamp of eternity. Thus, in whatever direction the new revolution in philosophy may go, it is beyond question that it may not relinquish the will to rigorous science, but instead must, as theoretical science, confront the practical striving proper to the worldview, and with full consciousness, part with such striving. For here all attempts at mediation also must be rejected. The advocates of the new worldview philosophy will perhaps object that to pursue the latter need not mean that one abandon the idea of rigorous science. The true worldview philosopher, they will say, will not only be scientific in laying the foundation, that is, by using all that is given by the rigorous individual sciences as solid building blocks, but he will also employ scientific method and will gladly seize every chance to promote philosophical problems in a rigorously scientific way. Only in contrast to the metaphysical timidity and skepticism of the preceding epoch, he will even pursue the loftiest metaphysical problems with bold daring in order to achieve the goal of a worldview that harmoniously satisfies the intellect and heart in accordance with the state of the age. Insofar as this is meant as mediation, intended to blur the line between worldview philosophy and scientific philosophy, we must lodge our protest against it. It can only lead to a softening and weakening of the scientific drive and promote a pseudo-scientific literature which is lacking in intellectual honesty. There are no compromises here, no more here than in any other science. We could no longer hope for theoretical results if the worldview drive were to become all-dominating and also deceive theoretical natures by means of its scientific forms. If over millennia the greatest scientific minds, passionately dominated by the will to science, have achieved not one piece of pure doctrine in philosophy, and all that is great that they have achieved, albeit imperfectly developed, they have achieved only owing to this will, then the worldview philosophers will certainly not be able to think that they can promote and definitively justify philosophical science on the side. Those who place the goal in the finite, who want to have their system and in time enough to be able to live by it, are in no way called to do so. Here there is only one thing to do. With complete honesty, worldview philosophy must itself waive its claim to be science, and thus cease at the same time, which surely is contrary to its purest intentions anyway, to confuse minds and hinder the progress of scientific philosophy. Its ideal goal should remain simply the worldview, which by its essence is precisely not science. It should not let itself be swayed in this respect by that fanaticism for science that is all too widespread in our age, and that disparages everything as unscientific, that cannot be demonstrated with scientific exactness. Science's one value among other, equally legitimate values. That in particular the value of the worldview stands with complete firmness on its own ground, that it is to be judged the habitus and achievement of the individual personality, whereas science is to be judged the achievement of the collective work of generations of investigators, that we have shown clearly in the foregoing. And just as both have different sources of value, they likewise have different functions, and different ways of having an effect, and of teaching. Worldview philosophy teaches, just as wisdom teaches. Personality addresses personality. Thus, only one may teach and address the wider public in the style of such philosophy, who is called to it either through a particularly significant individual manner and individual wisdom, or as a servant of higher, practical, religious, ethical, legal, etc. interests. However, science is impersonal. Its coworker does not need wisdom, but theoretical talent. What he contributes enriches the treasure of eternal validities that must be beneficial to mankind. Yet, as we saw above, that holds to an exceptionally high degree of philosophical science. Only after the decisive distinction of the one philosophy from the other has taken hold in the consciousness of the age, does it become thinkable that philosophy could assume the form and language of genuine science and recognize that what is frequently praised and even imitated about it, its profundity, is imperfection. Profundity is a symptom of chaos that genuine science wants to transform into a cosmos, into a simple, completely clear, lucid order. As far as its actual doctrine reaches, genuine science knows no profundity. Every piece of complete science is a whole made of steps of thought, each of which is immediately evident, and thus not at all profound. Profundity is a matter of wisdom, conceptual distinctness and clarity a matter of rigorous theory. Reminting the conjectures of profundity into definite rational formations is the essential process of the reconstruction of the rigorous sciences. Even the exact sciences had their long periods of profundity, and just as in the battles of the Renaissance, so too in the battles of the present, we dare to hope, philosophy will fight its way from the level of profundity to that of scientific clarity. To do so, however, it needs only the right sureness of goal and the great will, which in full consciousness is aimed at the goal, and exerts all available scientific energies. Our age is called an age of decadence. I cannot regard this reproach as justified. One will hardly be able to find in history an age in which such a sum of working forces was set into motion and was at work with such success. We might not always approve of the goals. We might also deplore that in quieter epochs, in which people passed their lives more contentedly, blossoms of the life of spirit grew, the likes of which we could neither find nor hope for in our epoch. And yet, even if what has been wanted, and has been wanted again and again, may in our age repel the aesthetic sense, for which the naive beauty of what has grown freely is of so much greater concern, what immense values nevertheless lie in the volitional sphere, if only great wills find the right goals. One would do our age quite an injustice were one to impute to it the will to what is base. Whoever is capable of awakening belief, of giving rise to understanding and enthusiasm for the greatness of a goal, will easily find the strength to devote to that goal. I mean our age is by its vocation a great age, only it suffers from the skepticism that has undermined the old, unclarified ideals. And it suffers precisely for that reason from the all too slight development and power of philosophy, which is still not far enough along, still not scientific enough, to be able to overcome skeptical negativism, which calls itself positivism, by means of true positivism. Our age wants to believe only in realities. Now, its strongest reality is science, and thus philosophical science is what our age needs most. But if, interpreting the sense of our age, we turn to this great goal, then we must also realize that we can achieve it only in one way. Namely, if with the radicalism belonging to the essence of genuine philosophical science, we accept nothing given in advance, accept nothing as a beginning that has been handed down, nor allow ourselves to be blinded by any names, no matter how great, but rather seek to gain the beginnings through free devotion to the problems themselves and the demands radiating from them. Certainly, we also need history, not, to be sure, after the manner of the historians, losing ourselves in the developmental context in which the great philosophies have grown up, but in order to allow the philosophies themselves, through their own spiritual content, to have a stimulating effect on us. Indeed, out of these historical philosophies, philosophical life flows towards us with the entire wealth and strength of vital motivations, provided we understand how to look into them, to penetrate to the soul of their words and theories. But it is not through philosophies that we become philosophers. To get bogged down in the historical, to busy oneself with it in a historical critical activity, and to want to achieve philosophical science by means of an eclectic treatment or an anachronistic renaissance, that results only in hopeless attempts. Not philosophies, but the things and the problems are the point from which the impulse to inquiry must issue. But by its essence, philosophy is the science of the true beginnings, of the origins, of the roots of everything. The science of the radical must itself be radical in its procedure and in every respect. Above all, it must not rest until it has obtained its own absolutely clear beginnings. That is, its own absolutely clear problems, the methods prescribed by the proper sense of these problems, and the lowermost field of work wherein the things are given with absolute clarity. Only one may nowhere renounce radical presuppositionlessness, and, for instance, from the start identify such things with empirical facts, thus to feign blindness to the ideas, which indeed are absolutely given in so great an extent in immediate intuition. We are under the spell of prejudices that date from the Renaissance. It is a matter of indifference to one truly without prejudice, whether a judgment comes from Kant or Thomas Aquinas, whether from Darwin or Aristotle, from Helmholtz or Paracelsus. What is necessary is not the demand to see with one's eyes, but instead that one not, under the compulsion of prejudices, interpret away what has been seen, since in the most impressive sciences of modernity, the mathematical physical sciences, the great amount of work by far was done by indirect methods. We are only too inclined to overestimate indirect methods, and to misjudge the value of direct seizing upon. Yet it lies precisely in the essence of philosophy, insofar as it returns to the ultimate origins, that its scientific work moves in spheres of direct intuition, and it is the greatest step our age has to make to see that with philosophical intuition in the right sense, the phenomenological seizing upon essences, an endless field of work opens up, and a science that, without any indirectly symbolizing and mathematizing methods, without the apparatus of inferences and proofs, nevertheless obtains an abundance of the most rigorous cognitions, which are decisive for all further philosophy.